John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome
glory, hallelujah.
to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is episode 4 of the memoir Reminiscences of My Life in Camp with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers, by Susie King Taylor. Chapter 7, Castaway. There was a yacht that carried passengers from Hilton Head to Beaufort. There were also 5 small boats, which carried people over. The only people here, beside the soldiers, were Mrs. Lizzie Brown, who came over on a permit to see her husband, who was at this place, and was very ill. He died while she was there. Corporal Walker's wife, with her 2-year-old child, and Mrs. Seabrook. As soon as we could get the yacht, these persons I have mentioned, together with a comrade just discharged, an officer's boy, and myself, took passage on it for Beaufort. It was nearly dark before we had gone any distance, and about 8 o'clock we were cast away and were only saved through the mercy of God. I remember going down twice. As I rose the second time, I caught hold of the sail and managed to hold fast. Mrs. Walker held on to her child with one hand, while with the other she managed to hold fast to some part of the boat, and we drifted and shouted as loud as we could, trying to attract the attention of some of the government boats which were going up and down the river. But it was in vain. We could not make ourselves heard, and just when we gave up all hope, and in the last moment, as we thought, gave one more despairing cry, we were heard at Ladies Island. 2 boats were put off, and a search was made to locate our distressed boat. They found us at last, nearly dead from exposure. In fact, the poor little baby was dead, although her mother still held her by her clothing with her teeth. The soldier was drowned, having been caught under the sail and pinned down. The rest of us were saved. I had to be carried bodily, as I was thoroughly exhausted. We were given the best attention that we could get at this place where we were picked up. The men who saved us were surprised when they found me among the passengers, as one of them, William Geary of Darien, Georgia, was a friend of my husband. His mother lived about 2 miles from where we were picked up, and she told me she had heard cries for a long time that night, and was very uneasy about it. Finally, she said to her son, "I think some poor souls are cast away." "I don't think so, Mother," he replied. "I saw some people going down the river today. We know this is Christmas, and they are having a good time." But she still persisted that these were cries of distress and not of joy, and begged him to go out and see. So to satisfy her, he went outside and listened, and then he heard them also, and hastened to get the boats off to find us. We were capsized about 8:15 p.m., and it was near midnight when they found us. Next day, they kept a sharp lookout on the beach for anything that might be washed in from the yacht, and got a trunk and several other things. Had the tide been going out, we should have been carried to sea and lost. I was very ill under the doctor's care for some time in Beaufort. The doctor said I ought to have been rolled, as I had swallowed so much water. In January 1865, I went back to Coal Island, where I could be attended by my doctor, Dr. Minor, who did all in his power to alleviate my suffering, for I was swollen very much. This he reduced, and I recovered, but had a severe cough for a long time afterwards. Chapter 8. A Flag of Truce. In October 1864, 6 companies of the regiment were ordered to Gregg Landing, South Carolina. Captain L. W. Metcalf of Company G was appointed on General Saxton's staff as provost captain. Lieutenant James B. West acting as assistant general. As in some way our mail had been sent over to the Confederate side and their mail to us, Captain Metcalf and Lieutenant West were detailed to exchange these letters under a flag of truce. So, with an escort of 6 men of the companies at Port Royal Ferry, the flag was unfurled and the message shouted across the river to the Confederates. Captain Metcalf asked them to come over to our side, under the protection of our flag of truce. This the Confederates refused to do, having for their excuse that their boat was too far up the river, and so they had no way to cross the river to us. They asked Metcalf to cross to them. He at once ordered his men to stack arms, the Confederates following suit, and his boys in blue rowed him over, and he delivered the message, after having introduced himself to the rebel officers. One of these officers was Major Jones of Alabama, the other Lieutenant Scott of South Carolina. Major Jones was very cordial to our captain, but Lieutenant Scott would not extend his hand, and stood aside in sullen silence, looking as if he would like to take revenge then and there. Major Jones said to Captain Metcalf, "We have no one to fight for. Should I meet you again, I shall not forget we have met before." With this, he extended his hand to Metcalf and bade him goodbye. But Lieutenant Scott stood by and looked as cross as he possibly could. The letters were exchanged, but it seemed a mystery just how these letters got missent to the opposite sides. Captain Metcalf said he did not feel a mite comfortable while he was on the Confederate soil. As for his men, you can imagine their thoughts. I asked them how they felt on the other side, and they said, "We would have felt much better if we had our guns with us." It was a little risky, for sometimes the flag of truce is not regarded, but even among the enemy there are some good and loyal persons. Captain Metcalf is still living in Medford. He is 71 years old, and just as loyal to the old flag and the Grand Army of the Republic as he was from 1861 to 1866 when he was mustered out. He was a brave captain, a good officer, and was honored and beloved by all in the regiment. Chapter 9. Capture of Charleston. On February 28, 1865, the remainder of the regiment were ordered to Charleston, as there were signs of the rebels evacuating that city. Leaving Coal Island, we arrived in Charleston between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, and found the Rebs had set fire to the city and fled, leaving women and children behind to suffer and perish in the flames. The fire had been burning fiercely for a day and night. When we landed, under a flag of truce, our regiment went to work assisting the citizens in subduing the flames. It was a terrible scene. For 3 or 4 days the men fought the fire, saving the property and effects of the people. Yet these white men and women could not tolerate our black Union soldiers, for many of them had formerly been their slaves. And although these brave men risked life and limb to assist them in their distress, men, and even women, would sneer and molest them whenever they met them. I had quarters assigned me at a residence on South Battery Street, one of the most aristocratic parts of the city, where I assisted in caring for the sick and injured comrades. After getting the fire under control, the regiment marched out to the racetrack, where they camped until March 12th, when we were ordered to Savannah, Georgia. We arrived there on the 13th, about 8 o'clock in the evening, and marched out to Fairlawn, near the A&G Railroad, where we remained about 10 days, when we were ordered to Augusta, Georgia, where Captain Alexander Heasley of Company E was shot and killed by a Confederate. After his death, Lieutenant Parker was made captain of the company, and was with us until the regiment was mustered out. He often told me about Massachusetts, but I had no thought at that time that I should ever see that state, and stand in the cradle of liberty. The regiment remained in Augusta for 30 days, when it was ordered to Hamburg, South Carolina, and then on to Charleston. It was while on their march through the country, to the latter city, that they came into contact with the bushwhackers, as the rebels were called, who hid in the bushes and would shoot the Union boys every chance they got. Other times, they would conceal themselves in the cars used to transfer our soldiers, and when our boys, worn out and tired, would fall asleep, these men would come out from their hiding places and cut their throats. Several of our men were killed in this way, but it could not be found out who was committing these murders, until one night one of the rebels was caught in the act, trying to cut the throat of a sleeping soldier. He was put under guard, court-martialed, and shot at Wall Hollow. First Lieutenant Jerome T. Furman and a number of soldiers were killed by these South Carolina bushwhackers at Wall Hollow. After this man was shot, however, the regiment marched through unmolested to Charleston. Chapter 10. Mustered Out. The regiment, under Colonel Trowbridge, reached Charleston in November 1865, and camped on the racetrack until January, when they returned to Morris Island, and on February 9, 1866, the following general orders were received, and the regiment mustered out. They were delighted to go home, but oh, how they hated to part from their commanding chief, Colonel C.T. Trowbridge. He was the very first officer to take charge of black soldiers. We thought there was no one like him, for he was a man among his soldiers. All in the regiment knew him personally, and many were the jokes he used to tell them. I shall never forget his friendship and kindness towards me, from the first time I met him to the end of the war. There was never anyone from the north who came into our camp, but he would bring them to see me. While on a visit south in 1888, I met a comrade of the regiment, who often said to me, "You up north, Mrs. King, do you ever see Colonel Trowbridge? How I should like to see him. I don't see why he does not come south sometime." Why, I would take a day off and look up all the boys I could find if I knew he was coming. I knew this man meant what he said, for the men of the regiment knew Colonel Trowbridge first of all the other officers. He was with them on St. Simon and at Camp Saxton. I remember when the company was being formed, we wished Captain C.T. was our captain, because most of the men in Company E were the men he brought with them from St. Simon, and they were attached to him. He was always jolly and pleasing with all. I remember when going into Savannah in 1865, he said that he had been there before the war, and told me many things I did not know about the river. Although this was my home, I had never been on it before. No officer in the Army was more beloved than our late Lieutenant Colonel C.T. Trowbridge. Copy of General Orders. Headquarters, 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers, Morris Island, South Carolina, February 9th, 1866. General Order Number 1. Comrades, the hour is at hand when we must separate forever, and nothing can take from us the pride we feel when we look upon the history of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. The first black regiment that ever bore arms in defense of freedom on the continent of America. On the 9th day of May 1862, at which time there were nearly 4 millions of your race in bondage, sanctioned by the laws of the land, and protected by our flag. On that day, in the face of the floods of prejudice that well nigh deluged every avenue to manhood and true liberty, you came forth to do battle for your country and kindred. For long and weary months, without pay, or even the privilege of being recognized as soldiers, you labored on, only to be disbanded and sent to your homes without even a hope of reward. And when our country, necessitated by the deadly struggle with armed traitors, finally granted you the opportunity again to come forth in defense of the nation's life, the alacrity with which you responded to the call gave abundant evidence of your readiness to strike a manly blow for the liberty of your race. And from that little band of hopeful, trusting, and brave men who gathered at Camp Saxton, on Port Royal Island, in the fall of '62, amidst the terrible prejudices that surrounded us, has grown an army of 140,000 black soldiers, whose valor and heroism has won for your race a name which will live as long as the undying pages of history shall endure, and by whose efforts, united with those of the white man, armed rebellion has been conquered. The millions of bondsmen have been emancipated, and the fundamental law of the land has been so altered as to remove forever the possibility of human slavery being established within the borders of redeemed America. The flag of our fathers, restored to its rightful significance, now floats over every foot of our territory, from Maine to California, and beholds only free men. The prejudices which formerly existed against you are well nigh rooted out. Soldiers, you have done your duty, and acquitted yourselves like men, who, actuated by such ennobling motives, could not fail. And as the result of your fidelity and obedience you have won your freedom. And oh, how great the reward! It seems fitting to me that the last hours of our existence as a regiment should be passed amidst the unmarked graves of your comrades at Fort Wagner. Near you rest the bones of Colonel Shaw, buried by an enemy's hand in the same grave with his black soldiers who fell at his side, where in the future of your children's children will come on pilgrimages to do homage to the ashes of those who fell in this glorious struggle. The flag, which was presented to us by the Reverend George B. Cheever and his congregation of New York City on the 1st of January 1863, the day when Lincoln's immortal proclamation of freedom was given to the world, and which you have borne so nobly through the war, is now to be rolled up forever and deposited in our nation's capital, and while there it shall rest, with the battles in which you have participated inscribed upon its folds. It will be a source of pride to us all to remember that it has never been disgraced by a cowardly faltering in the hour of danger, or polluted by a traitor's touch. Now that you are to lay aside your arms, I adjure you, by the associations and history of the past, and the love you bear for your liberties, to harbor no feelings of hatred towards your former masters, but to seek in the paths of honesty, virtue, sobriety, and industry, and by a willing obedience to the laws of the land, to grow up to the full stature of American citizens. The church, the schoolhouse, and the right forever to be free are now secured to you, and every prospect before you is full of hope and encouragement. The nation guarantees to you full protection and justice, and will require from you in return that respect for the laws and orderly deportment which will prove to every one your right to all the privileges of free men. To the officers of the regiment I would say, your toils are ended. Your mission is fulfilled, and we separate forever. The fidelity, patience, and patriotism with which you have discharged your duties to your men and to your country entitle you to a far higher tribute than any words of thankfulness which I can give you from the bottom of my heart. You will find your reward in the proud conviction that the cause for which you have battled so nobly has been crowned with abundant success. Officers and soldiers of the 33rd United States Colored Troops, once the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, I bid you all farewell, by order of Lieutenant Colonel C.T. Trowbridge, Commanding Regiment. E.W. Hyde, 1st Lieutenant, 33rd United States Colored Troops and Acting Adjutant. I have one of the original copies of these orders still in my possession. My dear friends, do we understand the meaning of war? Do we know or think of that war of '61? No, we do not. Only those brave soldiers and those who had occasion to be in it can realize what it was. I can and shall never forget that terrible war until my eyes close in death. The scenes are just as fresh in my mind today as in '61. I see now each scene, the roll call, the drum tap, lights out, the call at night when there was danger from the enemy, the double force of pickets, the cold and rain. How anxious I would be, not knowing what would happen before morning. Many times I would dress, not sure, but all would be captured. Other times I would stand at my tent door and try to see what was going on, because night was the time the rebels would try to get into our lines and capture some of the boys. It was mostly at night when our men went out for their scouts, and often had to hand-to-hand fight with the rebels. And although our men came out sometimes with a few killed or wounded, none of them, ever, were captured. We do not, as the black race, properly appreciate the old veterans, white or black, as we ought to. I know what they went through, especially those black men, for the Confederates had no mercy on them. Neither did they show any towards the white Union soldiers. I have seen the terrors of that war. I was the wife of one of those men who did not get a penny for 18 months for their services, only their rations and clothing. I cannot praise General David Hunter too highly, for he was the first man to arm the black man. In the beginning of 1862, he had a hard struggle to hold all the Southern Division with so few men, So he applied to Congress. But the answer to him was, "Do not bother us," which was very discouraging. As the general needed more men to protect the islands and do garrison duty, he organized 2 companies. I look around now and see the comforts that our younger generation enjoy, and think of the blood that was shed to make these comforts possible for them, and see how little some of them appreciate the old soldiers. My heart burns within me at this want of appreciation. There are only a few of them left now. So let us all, as the ranks close, take a deeper interest in them. Let the younger generation take an interest also, and remember that it was through the efforts of these veterans that they, and we older ones, enjoy our liberty today. Chapter 11. After the War. We will pick up next week. And of course, I just have some light thoughts for this episode. Susie King Taylor surviving her vessel, her boat flipping over, is one heck of a crazy story, especially being rescued essentially at the last minute and not dying of hypothermia is wild. I'm a little bit sad that not everyone made it, but, those things happen. And especially when people are on the move and you have these great migrations happening, very wild things happen all of the time. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which was General Order Number 1. Probably one of the best goodbye letters I've ever read. It made me very emotional to read it. And then while I was editing, to go back and listen to it, I would absolutely 100% love to shake every single one of those soldiers' hands, along with Mrs. Taylor as well. But I'm a little late, I suppose. Anyway, just an incredible story. It's such a gift to read. But with that, my friends, thank you for listening to the episode. I just want to remind you that you can support the show by going to my website, which has a link to the Patreon, or you could go to PayPal, which is www.paypal.com/PayPalMe/Rebellion Stories. Or you can just check the details in the description for this episode, and the link will be there. All right, with that, my friends, thank you for listening. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave. And Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. And now, though the grass grows green above his grave, his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so few. and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. John Brown was John the Baptist, of the Christ we are to see. Christ who of the bondman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny South the slaves shall all be free, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. The conflict that he heralded, he looked from heaven to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall sing with anthems o'er the deed they mean to do, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. Soldiers of freedom, then strike while strike ye may, the death blow of oppression in a better time and way. The dawn of old John Brown has brightened into day, and his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. For his soul